How did a single congregation grow to become one of the largest and most influential churches in America, only to experience a cataclysmic decline that placed its very existence in doubt? How did that same church endure a brutal and painful season of change to emerge from the transition stronger, more united, and more committed than ever to Jesus' Great Commission? I want to tell you this story. This is a story about the way ministry is changing in a new and harsher world, painfully different than the one known by our parents and grandparents. It's a story for pastors who face the daunting task of leading their churches through necessary but excruciating seasons of transition so they can move from surviving to thriving. This is a story for people who are part of those churches and experiencing the profound loss, the painful heartbreak, and the intense frustration that always comes with change. This is the story of what happened at First Baptist, the rise, ruin, and restoration of one of America's great churches. Change is going to happen in your ministry. That is what we talked about in our last episode. On this episode, I want to talk about the fact that change is going to hurt. And as we think about the pain of change, I want to tell you a story about a tonsillectomy that I had a little over a decade ago. All of our kids had been born, but our youngest was just a little baby. And that summer, I got incredibly sick. Every day I felt terrible. Every day I was running a fever of 100, 101, 102. Sometimes it would get up to 104. I went to the doctor, and the doctor told me that I had strep throat. And so they gave me antibiotics for the strep throat. And the antibiotics made me feel better for a little bit, but ultimately, I got worse. And then they moved me away from oral antibiotics to the injectable kind. And I got 3 injections of antibiotics. Each time I got the injection, I would feel better for a day or so, and then I would start to feel like trash again. And ultimately, they concluded that the strep throat was simply not going away. Now, I don't know if you know this or not, but you can't live with strep throat. Eventually, it moves to various important organs, and ultimately, it's lethal. You'll die if you don't solve the problem of strep throat. And so I ultimately got referred to an ear, nose, and throat specialist for the removal of my tonsils. And when I visited this ENT, he let me know that this surgery was going to be an incredibly painful recovery. That is true because he said, I'm going to be essentially burning 2 holes in your body's most sensitive tissue. And he said, in addition to that, because I'd had strep throat so many times in my life, I'd had multiple layers of scar tissue that had grown every time I had recovered from strep throat. And so he said, the recovery from the burning out of this tissue is probably going to be the most intense physical pain you've ever experienced. He made it clear that it was the closest thing to torture I was ever likely to experience. He told me that even though he would give me the most powerful narcotics he was able to give me, he still had grown men calling him, begging him for more help, begging him for relief. The point that he was trying to make is that something has to change. I cannot live with strep throat, and so this change is going to have to happen, but the change is going to be very, very painful. That's the lesson of this episode, is that change is painful because change entails loss. And the pain of loss, like the pain of recovery from a tonsillectomy, happens in the short term. You don't have a tonsillectomy so that you can hurt for the rest of your life. You have a tonsillectomy so that you can get better, so that you can heal, so that you can be stronger, and you accept the loss and the pain in the short term for the gain in the long term. It is the same with ministry change. When you change, everyone is going to feel the pain of the loss.
My understanding is everybody's wounded. Things are really vitriolic, lots of transition. It's kind of unpredictable, but it was also exciting because I wanted to do stuff like this.
Wanted to do something that mattered. You don't do ministry change so that you can hurt, so that your ministry can be weak and frail for the rest of your time there. You do ministry change so that on the other side of the painful loss, you can be strong, you can thrive. In the short term, though, that painful loss is excruciating. And in the short term, that is what people want to focus on. In the short term, in my tonsillectomy, even though I knew I didn't have a tonsillectomy, so I would hurt for the rest of my life, but in the first 2 weeks after the tonsillectomy, what I felt was excruciating, mind-numbing, distracting pain. What people felt at First Baptist Church was the painful loss of the change.
All of a sudden there was a massive set of changes. I'm not sure exactly what year that all went down, but like she said, so much of it was based on rumor, and then more people told things about the rumor. Unfortunately, I was not ever privy to the email stream that was going around. The only thing I saw on someone's phone one time, he said, "I can't believe this. They're asking all of us to asking the whole staff to resign in some mass email." And I hadn't seen anything about it. And I was just surprised that there was that much vitriol, that much animosity and bitterness and resentment that would cause people to want to leave instead of solving things biblically.
One of the things that I was so thankful for about my doctor who did my tonsillectomy is that he did warn me, this is going to hurt. He told me, he said, it's going to feel when you wake up from surgery like you have a hot poker that's sitting in your throat. And that made me nervous when he said it, but I was thankful that he told me because it helped me with my expectations. In the language of Jesus, it helped me to count the cost. One of the most significant lessons I learned in the last few years at First Baptist Church, which were the hardest of my life, was just how painful change can be. You're going to have to change or die. Change is a necessity. On this episode, we're going to look at 4 different kinds of pain. And the first is the pain of the loss of familiarity. The pain of the loss of familiarity. When you have a ministry that you love, when you have a ministry that has impacted you, that has changed you, and that you've seen change others, it gets comfortable. It gets familiar. That familiarity feels like a warm, comforting blanket. That comfort comes from the programs and the places and the way we have done things. I've made repeatedly clear on this podcast that there is a crucial distinction between the principles that never change and the practices and the practical realities that must always change. The problem is the only ministry most of us are going to know are the practical manifestations of those principles that are unchanging. That is to say, we don't know of another way to do ministry than the way we saw that we loved, that changed us, and that we saw work for others. What this is a problem of our ministry imagination. When you see a ministry work in a very certain way, in a very peculiar and particular time, you just can't imagine a ministry working without it. You can't imagine a ministry being effective without that place, without that person, without that kind of music, without that particular kind of organization. And listen, nobody's at fault for that. People's experiences are what they are. All of our churches, all of our ministries have things like this, these things that are culturally constrained ways of expressing ministry principles. At First Baptist Church, there were a lot of things like that. I've talked about our evangelism strategy. I've talked about our music ministry. There were institutions and traditions and thousands of people connected to almost everything we did. One of those realities was the main auditorium. I mentioned the construction and meaningfulness of the main auditorium in an earlier episode. But the reality is, our main auditorium was old. It was in disrepair, though it was paid for when it was constructed. It had not been maintained over the 2.5 previous decades. The sound system was old and failing. As a matter of fact, every technician that we had come look at it said this thing is broken beyond repair, and one day you're going to walk in and you're going to turn it on and it won't come on. And when it doesn't come on, you're not going to be having church in the 10,000 seat auditorium without amplification. And so their solution was to not turn it off. So they just left it on all the time. And it got to be, I believe, about a decade past its end of life and was just experiencing all sorts of problems. And every Sunday, we were just rolling the dice. Are we going to be able to have church in here today? Are the microphones going to work? Are the speakers going to work? Is the technology at the soundboard going to work? And it was going to be in the millions of dollars to replace it. I mentioned before about deferred maintenance. One of the worst buildings for deferred maintenance was our main auditorium. To keep that massive room cool, it took 3 air conditioning chillers. Those chillers were about $250,000 a piece, and 2 of them in the main auditorium were dead. They needed to be fully replaced. The third one was way past its end of life, and it was that third one, that single chiller, that was keeping an entire building cool. It was doing the work of 3 chillers, and it was going to go out one day. And when that went out, it was going to be a $750,000 fix to replace those chillers. There are other way more boring problems I could tell you about, but I'm just telling you the facility was broken. And here's the other thing. It was never full. On an average Sunday at First Baptist Church in 2016, 2018, 2019, we would have anywhere between 2,500 to 3,500 people. That was a big range, but we would have several thousand people on a Sunday morning. That's a tremendous number of people to have in church. But you put those people in a room with a capacity for 10,000 people, and it looked like nobody came to church that day. It looked like a tick in a milk jug. The largest crowd we ever had in a single service since I came to First Baptist Church was Easter Sunday of 2019. And on Easter Sunday of 2019, we had over 6,000 people at First Baptist Church. That's the largest crowd of people I have ever personally preached to. It is a massive crowd of people by any estimation. It was actually encouraging to see the attendance report, but it's discouraging to look out over the room and see so many empty pews.
Look at how few people are in the pews. Look at the budget numbers I'm drawing out like conclusions over 15 years, like this is where we were in, 97, and then this is where we are in 2018, and like what happened and what are we going to do about it?
The reality is the main auditorium was just not working for us. It needed to change. It needed to go. We didn't need it. We couldn't afford to remodel it. And so we sold it. When we sold it, we took a long time to get our congregation ready for that. We talked about it. We spent a lot of time in members' meetings, and ultimately the congregation approved it. We were told by the buyers that it would be torn down and apartments would be built in its place. We were very excited about that. It was thrilling to think about going from a room that was too big for us and in disrepair that we could not take care of to replacing that with a building full of people that we could reach with the good news of Jesus Christ. But in the short term, the buyers, while they still may build apartments there, in the short term, they have decided to use what is now their property to create an event venue in downtown Jacksonville. They turned a portion of the building into a room where Van Gogh's artwork moves around in a 360-degree environment. Lauren and I were given some special tickets for opening night of that event as the pastor and wife who oversaw the selling of the venue to that new group. And I have to tell you, it was hard for me to go to that event. My wife and I stood in line. We gave them our names and were admitted into the building. We saw some of the work they'd done to prepare for the new exhibit. There was a bar in the auditorium where people were drinking alcohol. And then we walked into the event venue itself. I want to say that it was a remarkable presentation. It was an incredibly even moving experience to see this 360-degree display of artwork. It was really quite beautiful. But in another sense, it was very discouraging to me. One of the things that they did as you're going into the event is they have all these quotes from Vincent van Gogh. And I took a picture of one of the quotes of Van Gogh from 1889. And here's what it says. It says, "It's difficult to know oneself, but it isn't easy to paint oneself either." And I looked at that and I said to my wife, "Lauren, I want you to look at that ridiculous quote." Now listen, if you're a Van Gogh fan, I'm not trying to trash you. But I said, we are in a room where Psalm 23 was preached by some of the greatest living preachers in a generation. We are in a room where Romans chapter 8 was preached by some of the best preachers you've ever heard. And now projected on the wall is a quote from Van Gogh. "It's difficult to know yourself, but it isn't easy to paint yourself either." Like that matters? And I just have to tell you, I acutely felt the loss. I hated it. That painful loss doesn't change the fact that we could not afford that building. The building had not been kept up. It was not usable. It was condemnable. That loss doesn't change the fact that we were happy to take the money from the people who sold us the building, and we're pouring that into ministry right now. We're pouring that into the proclamation of Jesus's name. It's a remarkable win to turn a building that we couldn't use and that was killing us into practical financial resources that can use to be advancing the name of Jesus. But I'm telling you, it still hurt. It still hurt to say goodbye to that place that had meant so much to so many, that had accomplished so much in the kingdom. And here's what I want you to know. If it was painful to me, who'd been here for 7 years, it was way more painful to people who invested in that building, who were there on move-in day. It was way more painful to members of the Lindsay family, who in fact are still members of our church. I told you that this episode is about counting the cost. And I want you to hear something very painful. Nancy Westbrook is the daughter of Homer and Shirley Lindsay, the granddaughter of Homer Lindsay Sr. She is committed to First Baptist Church. She's committed to her family. She loves and respects what her family built here and what the Lord is currently doing. And I talked with her. She was one of the many people that I interviewed for this podcast. And I talked to her about this painful loss of familiarity. I talked to her about her family's investment. I talked to her about the reality that after we sold the main auditorium, the new owners paid a junk removal company to tear out the pews that were left. And that junk removal company posted the pictures online. And here is what Miss Nancy Westbrook, the daughter of Homer Lindsay Jr., said when she saw those pictures.
"I thought I was going to die. That was so hard."
There is nothing wrong with this kind of pain. Dr. Lindsay's daughter is actually doing everything right. There's nothing about this pain that undoes the requirement to change. I want you to know that when we lose these places, it actually is understandable that it hurts. We need to appreciate that people are going to go through pain. One of the most faithful and long-serving members of our church is a woman named Angela Ryan. And I asked her about this, and here's what she had to say about the pain of losing these familiar places.
I remember asking them, he showed that video to the church? You know, the one of you walking through?
Yeah, and the brown water and stuff.
Yeah. I was like, what? That actually played in the sanctuary? That's terrible. But it was more terrible that that's what it was, you know. It was really hard to hear, you know, that was the state of our church, the buildings themselves. Because like I said, it's like your house. It's just a house, but you love it. But it's a place that we love. So it was just hard.
The reality is we cannot, for sentimental reasons, go broke and fail to preach the gospel. We cannot, for reasons of honoring the past, keep a building that is killing us financially. But it's painful.
We must never make brick and mortar the church. The church is living stone. You and I are First Baptist Church, Jacksonville, Florida, not this building.
And there's not just the pain of the loss of familiarity. There's also the pain in lost relationships. Listen, church is about people. Church is about the relationships that we have with people. Church is about the people we serve with and the people we study the Bible with and the people we worship with. And when you make changes to church, some people are going to leave.
But there was just it was a real flippant sense of commitment. Like, well, if I don't like the way things are going here, I'll just go somewhere else. And that's really what began to happen.
I need to be clear about this. This is part of it. People come to our ministries, they come to our churches based on certain terms. I realize there were a lot of people who left First Baptist Church when I initiated the changes that we needed to initiate in order to survive. And I get it. I don't begrudge anybody. If somebody came to First Baptist Church because they loved a particular room, or they loved a particular way we were doing something, or they loved a particular staff person that we don't have with us anymore, I totally understand that. I love that they came for those things that they cherished. And if they're looking around going, hey, do you know what? When I came to First Baptist Church, it looked like one thing, and now it looks like a different thing, and this isn't a place that is best for me and my family to come to church anymore, I totally get that. One of the things that I have said to our staff, to our church, and even to other pastors around the city of Jacksonville is I don't get upset when people leave our church to go be more faithful at another church. I am not keeping score of personal wins for Heath Lambert or for First Baptist Church. I am keeping score of kingdom wins. And if you decide that you can more faithfully follow Jesus at a different church, if you decide that your family can more faithfully follow Jesus at a different church, and you go and you do that, that is a win. And I don't begrudge anybody for making a decision like that. But as understandable as the decision can be, it doesn't mean it's not painful. It doesn't mean when you're one of the ones who leaves that it's hard to say goodbye to people that you have loved and served with. It doesn't mean when you're one of the ones who stays and you have to watch your friends leave for a season, that is not incredibly painful. In fact, in my many interviews of church people for this podcast, one of the most significant interviews I had was with one of the most significant members at First Baptist Church. Her name is Rita Browning. She has been a member of First Baptist Church for decades. She has invested in this church. She loves and is committed to this church. She is right now today a very faithful Sunday school teacher. And I asked Miss Rita, what was the hardest part for you in the years of transition at First Baptist Church? And this is what she said.
I guess the low point was just seeing some of my close friends leave. Mm-hmm. It was hard for me because I had to watch my attitude, because it would almost make me angry. Mm-hmm. And we'd been friends for years and years and years. And then to hear some of the things that they would say. And I wasn't going to talk about my church.
Sure.
Or my pastor. I just wasn't going to do that.
So we've talked about the pain of the loss of familiarity. We've talked about the pain in lost relationships. I also want to talk about the pain of destruction and division. Listen, it's one thing to lose relationships because people decide in good conscience that they need to go to another church. It's another thing to lose relationships because of sinful destruction and division. It's one thing to leave a church. It's another thing to sin against each other and to sin against a church as you leave. Change is loss and pain for everyone. Everybody has to go through it. Every leader has to suffer the pain of the loss. Every member has to suffer the pain of the loss. And there are right ways to express that, even as we heard from Miss Nancy Westbrook. But some people in transition are going to respond with sinful division. This was terribly painful at First Baptist Church. There were so many examples of so many sinful kinds of division that I don't even know how to talk to you about all of them. But just to give you an example, people circulated letters calling me a liar when I was telling the truth. People posted petitions to get me fired from my job.
They were circulating a petition to have you removed, which meant nothing, but it became tense, and the people that were sharing it and what they were saying about it, and social media just gave freedom to say the worst things about you and about us and about the leadership, and it just got really painful to be here, and it affected every part of what it meant to live in Jacksonville and work at First Baptist Church. And I think we lost more people over that because they just looked around and said, I can't do this.
I'm not trying to make it sound like all of this relational sin was committed only against me. Far from it.
Well, I want to go kind of back further to explain it. I started off actually in, newlywed class and then young adult, and we were administrators and teachers in young adult. And I was 25 years old when I became a deacon. I was the last group of Dr. Vines, and there was probably 20 years between me and the next youngest deacon. I mean, I was the youngest, I think, by far. And so my goal was to bring on my peers. So between my first several years as a deacon, I brought 25 deacons on. Denomination process, bring them on and all that. So right when the upheaval happened, 17 of those 25 not only wanted to leave, and they heard all this stuff and didn't, but they called me an idiot, called me foolish, called me whatever, and attacked me for not leaving with them.
Oh, wow.
So I think it was hard for us.
Would you say that was the low point for you? Is just the personal loss of relationships?
People that you've invested in, spiritually, financially, time with, like you love their kids, and then they tell their kids don't hang out with the Knox girls.
I do want ministry leaders listening to this to count the cost and to know that there are going to be sins committed against you that are going to hurt. But this sinful division and destruction is committed against other people as well. There are people in our church right now today who remained in our church who are not on speaking terms with people who left because the people who left said, if you stay in that church, you can't be my friend anymore. There are business owners and business leaders who lost customers because if they said, hey, we support the changes at First Baptist, or we think that the leadership is telling the truth, they had people who cut off their business relationship because of that. It was sinfully destructive and sinfully divisive. I got threatening letters from lawyers, from people who would shock you. an amazing display of division and destruction. There were even a couple of churches in Jacksonville that got weaponized against First Baptist Church, and it became a popular thing on the Sunday that you walked out of First Baptist Church to attend another church. You would take a selfie of you and your family in front of this other church. It was so ugly. It was so sinful and so destructive. And here's what happens. Whether it's former staff people or whether it's former members, people get so committed to doing their thing, to having it their way, to their particular favorite manifestation of ministry, that they decide to destroy instead of living at peace. They decide to divide instead of showing love and care. And it was incredibly painful. I've been talking here about personal pain that I experienced from the sinful responses of people. I want you to hear from someone who knows me very well. She was my personal assistant during these hard years of transition. Her name is Amy Evenson, and she's a very good friend of mine. She's very close with the Lambert family. And here's how she explained what she saw of this sinful division and destruction.
People who you thought were with you all of a sudden were very much not. And people, staff people, church members that you had met with, I remember specific emails that people wrote to you being so encouraging, so excited, so for you, so happy about what you're doing, so grateful for your heart for people, so grateful for the way that you do ministry, so excited for the future. And over the course of several months, some even longer than that, those same people all of a sudden turned and were saying the opposite of that about you. And that was really hard for so many reasons.
That's the pain of the loss of familiarity, the pain in lost relationships, the pain of destruction and division. I also want you to prepare for the pain of uncertainty. One of the realities that shocked me the most is that I had to learn the hard way. There is no rule book for solving massive problems in a declining church. There's no one size fits all. There's no manual of here's what you do. When you find out you owe $90 million in bills you can't pay, here's how you fix that. There is no place to go to get those answers. Of course, there are large scale categories that we can think about, and we talked about those in the last episode on change. But there are a million details that are going to change in each and every situation. Your church is different than my church, is different than the guy's church down the street. And it is really hard to be facing a concrete danger and not have a clear, concrete destination and rule book about how to get to where you need to go. It is very hard when your plans and your goals have to be soft because there are so many pieces moving around. One of the great struggles I had as a pastor was when I had to level with our congregation about how hard things were. And I had dozens of people, maybe scores of people, come up to me and say, so are you saying that this is going to work? Are you assuring us that this is all going to pan out? And the reality is, the honest answer is no. I cannot give you a guarantee. I want to give you a guarantee. I love you, and believe me, I am invested in these plans working. But there are not guarantees. What I can guarantee you is that if we don't change, we will die. If we don't change, we are going to go belly up. When I stood up in front of our church and I explained to them that we were going broke, that our facilities were in disrepair, and that we had to do something aggressive, I proposed, as I told you, a one-block plan. And it involved a $30 million renovation, and it involved property sale. I pitched that one block plan as that which would solve our space problems, as that which would solve our money problems, because we had to get on less space with fewer staff so that we could afford to do ministry. One of the things that plan required was the selling of the building that housed the Lindsay Auditorium. As we talked with real estate brokers and land development experts, it was clear that we needed to sell that piece of property because in the layout of our property in downtown Jacksonville with our 12 blocks, that was the piece of property that they called the hole in the donut. It was that piece of property that connected the other blocks and made them contiguous. And the selling of that property was going to produce the tens of millions of dollars we were going to need to do our remodel and reconstruction. But then things got complicated. It started when the city began to give us a hard time about tearing down old buildings, which weren't on the historical registry, but they argued should be. And then the real disaster struck when in spring of 2020, the COVID pandemic hit, and it cratered the commercial real estate market in downtown Jacksonville. We put our property on the market, and before COVID struck, we had dozens of real estate developers looking at our blocks downtown, and we had every reason to hope we were going to get a financial windfall from a property developer who wanted to take a once-in-a-generation opportunity to get a chunk of downtown property in a major Florida city. But then COVID hit, and all of that interest from all of those buyers evaporated. And our visions of having a real estate windfall that would fund our ministry evaporated. And all of a sudden, the Hobson plan was not going to work. And we had to rearrange the plan.
I'm glad it worked out this way because you think about it, we were talking about borrowing $30 million. Mm-hmm. And we were going to try to amortize that out with the sale of property. Well, we know what real estate values did.
Yeah, it would have hurt us bad.
You know, the hand of the Lord was in that.
We still knew we needed to get on property that was less than what we were currently using, but we weren't going to be able to have a one-block plan without a multi-million-dollar renovation. And so we eventually had to change and use different property and reconfigure different blocks. And the Lord was really faithful with that. And actually, it brought a lot of joy to our people who were much happier to be able to stay in the Lindsay Auditorium. But the point was, the plan changed. And we had to trust the Lord, and we had to depend on that. And the Lord was kind and faithful, and the plan ultimately worked, even though it was a different plan than what we started out with. Change is brutal. Every participant in a dying ministry says they are willing to change. But I want you to know they mean the opposite. They don't know they mean the opposite. They think they mean what they say. They are good-hearted and good-natured. But here's what they actually mean. They mean they want the good times back. They absolutely do not want the pain that change is going to bring. This, by the way, is the same problem that leaders in ministry have. We say we want change, and we're thinking about the good things. We're thinking about expanded ministry. We're thinking about growing opportunities. We're thinking about healthy budgets and united staff, and we are not talking about the hard parts. We're not thinking about how much it's going to hurt, about how hard it's going to be. And this is why so many people don't make it in ministry transitions. It's why so many leaders quit, why they bail out. It's why so many members relocate to find someplace else, because they just don't want all of this pain. It's not just that change is hard. That's true enough. It's that this hardship is going to bring out the ugliest things you have ever seen from people who will shock the daylights out of you. I was not prepared for it. I was surprised by it. I nearly quit over it. It was by God's grace that I was able to endure it. And it is that reality that we're going to talk about in our next 2 episodes.